The weekly Industry Angel podcast hears from business leaders and entrepreneurs who share their stories and that all-important light bulb moment. This can inspire us all and maybe scratch that itch and kickstart that idea that keeps you awake at night. Welcome to episode 27 of the Industry Angel. I hope you're all enjoying the summer. You've had time to recharge those batteries. I had some time off last week actually with the family. And of course, what happens? You return to the delights of a bulging inbox. It takes you days to battle your way through. But hey, I love it. And I love hearing from you guys as well. So please remember to keep in touch. Host at industryangel.com. Let me know how you're enjoying the show. Are you running, relaxing, commuting? Drop us an email. I love to hear about your business journeys as well, and that really helps shape the guests that I try and hook up for you. Remember, I do reply to them all. I've had some great messages, so keep in touch. Our friends at Penguin Random House, you might remember, kindly supplied us with 5 copies of Screw Work, Break Free, written by John Williams from episode 25. So congratulations to the winners, Anthony Armstrong from Pit Stop Business Supplies, Dale Geach, David Smith, Steve Minto and Catherine Costa. We'll get the book out to you soon. Well done, guys. Don't forget to click review on iTunes as well. I know I keep badgering you on this one, but it really helps attract fantastic guests, such as... Today we have author, speaker and advisor Geoffrey Moore. Welcome to Industry Angel, Jeff.
Well, nice to be here, Ian. Thank you.
No worries. Well, Jeff, I know you're over in California, yeah?
Yes, I'm out here in Silicon Valley on Sand Hill Road, yes.
I'm going to be terribly British and tell you here it's about 70 degrees Fahrenheit and cloudy.
I'm from Oregon, and I've always felt that Oregon was actually an extension of the British Isles, but California is not. It's going to probably be around the 80s again today, and it's beautiful weather. We actually need more rain, actually. It's a drought problem, so that's our problem.
Oh, really? It sounds a bit Mediterranean, actually, where you are.
Yeah, maybe a little. We try to emulate Tuscany, but I don't think we actually quite get there.
Excellent. Well, Jeff, I'll give you a pretty standard introduction there, but I'd be really grateful if you could give our listeners a bit of a background to you and your work. Is that okay?
Sure. Well, so I actually started as a professor of English literature. I actually did a dissertation in Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, which goes back a little into the history of the British Isles. But in my 30s, we moved out to California. I joined a tech firm, and in my 40s, I joined a strategy consulting firm. And so since 1991, I've been working with executive teams in high-tech firms, initially around marketing strategy, and then around just in general business strategy. And then in this last 5 or 6 years, around actually organizational strategy, particularly for how do you catch the next wave? If you've caught one wave and you've been very successful, how do you catch the next wave? So it started with working with startups back in the 90s, and there was a book called Crossing the Chasm, which was all about that. And now it's come full circle, and now it's tried to cross the chasm the second time, but inside a larger company, and the book for that's called Zone to Win.
Right. Well, I'm going to ask you about some of your books, Jeff. The audience we have, I guess they're established B2B and B2C businesses. Some are early stage startups, some thinking about a new venture. But what I've learned from the feedback from our listeners is that such an increase now for like a thirst to learn. So before we dive in, have you noticed an increase in a quest for business knowledge, or has it always been at such a level?
It's interesting. I think the interest in business knowledge has gone up, even as the interest in business books has gone down. So business books had quite a lot of cachet in the 90s. And then somewhere I think it maybe got over-distributed. I also think the book industry went through a kind of a cataclysmic revolution. But what's been replaced with, I think, is podcasts like yours, and the internet in general. And also you're seeing a huge interest in business coming from developing economies that are getting traction. I mean, India being the most obvious, China being the most obvious. So I think in general, business and entrepreneurship in particular are getting a ton of attention around the world.
It's really interesting. I'm glad you said that. You talked about books there, and you're right. I mean, there's a lot of business books out there, Jeff. To be honest, some can be quite a daunting read, quite academic. And I know you've revised your book, Crossing the Chasm, over the years, but 25 years after its release, what have you sold? 1 million copies, translated in many languages. It's still held, though, as one of the top business books. It's been described as the Bible for entrepreneurial marketing. Why is it so popular still, Jeff, after all these years?
Well, I think what happened, so it was based on some really good work that I did not do. A guy named Edward Rogers did the original theory of diffusion of innovation, and then a fellow I worked for, a guy named Regis McKenna, applied it to high tech. And what I was able to do was simply introduce this notion of the chasm, which was a gap in the technology adoption life cycle that happens after the early adopters get success, but before the pragmatic majority are willing to buy in. And we were losing a lot of companies in that gap because we thought it was a time to ramp up, when in fact it's a time to actually narrow your focus across the chasm. But so that model has held up for B2B. Now, what was interesting about that model is virtually all of the 90s was B2B tech, and B2C tech kind of came along at the end, but it was always a trailing market. What happened when the high tech meltdown happened is that the B2B tech business kind of went into the tank for a while, but B2C, driven by Facebook and Google and companies of their ilk, just took off like a tear. And it turned out that B2C markets were not for crossing. Crossing the chasm, you could sort of jam it into a B2C strategy, but it really didn't belong there. And so then it kind of went quiet for a while. And then what's happened in this decade is that all the businesses have said, well, look, there's all this B2C computer infrastructure. We need to use it. We need to leverage it. We need to re-engineer our B2B model to be B2B2C. And then that caused Crossing the Chasm to come back in. And that's why I had to revise the book a third time to bring in new examples. But in this new world of cloud computing and mobile computing, all the B2B guys are needing to reinvent themselves. And that's what Crossing the Chasm is for.
In terms of influence, I think, your books have influenced others. We've got the Lean Startup, we've got the Strategizer work, around business modeling. And I actually spent a couple of days recently with Alex Osterwalder and Yves Pigneur, and we discussed topics such as your value positioning statement. So, this is your work's influenced others. About now in your consultant advising world, do you have a number of tools in your toolbox that you've borrowed from others? Who's influencing you, Jeff?
Well, that's great. Well, originally, I would say over the years, every 2 or 3 years, someone comes along and has a big influence. And originally, there was a Mike Treacy and Fred Wiersema did something around the value disciplines of market leaders, around product leadership, customer intimacy, and operational excellence. That was an extremely useful model. Clay Christensen came along in the late 90s and introduced the innovator's dilemma. And as soon as anybody saw that, you thought, wow, that's really, really helpful. Guys like Steve Blank and Eric, I'm having my mind, the Lean Startup, Eric
Wies, W-I-E-S, is it? Or Rise?
No, I don't think, well, whatever. I'm just having a mind blank. But anyway, the Lean Startup and 4 Steps to an Epiphany, those were extremely helpful for the B2C stuff. More recently, I just got introduced to a really interesting idea, and this is what's fun for me, around the distinction between high trust networks and low trust networks, and how each one of them works, and how they don't mix very well, but they have to interface with each other. And I think if I look at Silicon Valley or any of these entrepreneurship strategies, what companies are trying to do is set up very high trust networks inside themselves. And one of the struggles that large corporations have is that their annual budgeting process is a low trust network process. And so it's very hard for the innovation teams and the more structural traditional teams to collaborate successfully. And that the new book called Zone to Win is all about how would you manage that problem.
So is that your latest book, Jeff?
That's my latest book, yeah. It's based on work I did with Salesforce, with Mark Benioff and his team, and at Microsoft with Satya Nadella and then Chi Lu, who runs the Office business at Microsoft. And again, both of these are both large corporations, so they have both low trust and high trust networks operating inside of them. And creating zones is a way of trying to keep them from interfering with each other, but at the same time trying to create interfaces that are operable so that you just don't ignore each other.
That's really interesting. So are we talking now a large corporation that wants to be entrepreneurial, wants to be innovative, but with the size of it, it's hard to do that.
Well, the interesting thing is it's not hard to get started. Most large corporations can create an incubation zone. We call it an incubation zone, and they can start skunkworks projects. They can acquire some, technology, small technology companies, and hope to build on them. The challenge happens when they try to scale the new, because you have to go. We have this saying which says, if you want to catch the next S curve, you have to go through a J curve. And what that means is an S curve obviously is one of these great adoption life cycles that just takes over the world. But you have to invest and lose money at the beginning. So you go through a J curve financially. And venture capital and all the venture organizations are set up specifically to do that. I mean, that's why people give money to venture capitalists. It's how venture capitalists invest. It's how entrepreneurs work. But in large public companies, you're counter incentive to go through a J curve. Your investors don't want you to, your inside people don't want you to, your customers and your partners don't want you to. So what happens when these companies try to scale their big investments, their next generation investments, is they get caught up in a huge number of contradictions. And this is why the zoning is so important, because you've got to face these contradictions very clearly. And then you have to realize you can only do probably one J curve at a time, and maybe only one every 5 to 10 years. So you have to be very thoughtful. But then when you pick the curve you're going to do it on, you cannot stop. You have to go all the way through. And sadly, what most companies do is get halfway in and get cold feet and pull back, and then they get the worst of all of them.
Sure, I guess that would work for acquisitions as well. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, most of these things to get to scale, you have to. If you're a large company, you can't organically get your next big business to scale without doing at least one major acquisition, but the key again is you see these companies do major acquisitions, but they don't graft onto the mothership, or the graft onto the host tree, or whatever the right metaphor is,
Yeah.
and so they wither on the vine. And I mean, look at what happened with Nokia, for example, at Microsoft. It just withered. And so you've got to make sure that if you do one of these things, you make the graft work.
What about when you've done an acquisition, Jeff, and it's a very different animal to the lead mothership, if you like? How do you do that? Do you
Well,
just let it?
so it's interesting. You can, I mean, so let's suppose they wanted to go into an entirely different business. If you're not leveraging the same go-to-market capability, if you really are going into a brand new business and all you're really doing is leveraging your balance sheet, you can be like sort of like General Electric and have like a whole new business area when they bought NBC, for example, at one point. But most companies aren't doing that. Most companies want to go into an adjacent business where they can still use their same Salesforce or marketing capability or professional services capability. And that's when it gets really hard, because those organizations are incented to make the current quarter's financial commitments. At the same time, they're being asked to make major sacrifices to get the new business really up to scale fast. And unless you are very explicit about those contradictions, the contradictions kill you.
Yeah, and I think that S curve. What did you say? 3 years? Did you say
If
there?
you want to catch the next S curve, you have to
Yeah,
go through a J curve.
sure.
And it's just, I mean, I put up that slide, and inevitably it gets lots of chuckles from people because it just hurts so much. They've been through it so many times.
Yeah, no, I've been through that, and I think that J curve can take years. Yeah.
Yeah, well, if you look at how venture is set up, venture expects a J curve to probably at the least be 3 years, more likely 5, and maybe as much as 7 to 8. So if
Right.
you ask a public investor to put up with substandard earnings for a period of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, they'll just sell your stock. And so it's very important when you want to do one of these things that you first of all you have to signal the investment community what you're doing, and some people will sell your stock, but hopefully you will attract others who will be want to buy into and take this with you. But the public market, it's hard in the public markets. Unlike the venture markets, where the capital is excited by this kind of risk, most public investors are not. And so it's a real. I have enormous empathy for any CEO who's trying to do this. Now, what turns out is that most of them, so I think voluntarily doing this, it's the rare CEO. Typically, the founder tech CEO are the famous ones, the Jeff Bezoses, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Mark Benioffs, those people. But many CEOs today now have realized if I don't get on this new digital wave, I'm out of business entirely. And to get on that wave, you have to go through a J curve. And so, but they looked at Kodak, which managed to avoid going through a J curve, but it eventually put them out of business. And so they're
Sure.
kind of between a rock and a hard place.
Is that why you revised the book, Jeff? And what was it, 2014? I think you revised it?
Well, no, the Crossing the Chasm
The
book
Crossing the
is
Chasm.
for the entrepreneurs. So
Yes.
that playbook has not changed in 25 years. It's for the
Okay.
venture-backed companies, though. So the venture-backed companies still have this problem of I get these few, I've got a few exciting early customers. They're typically marquee customers. Everybody's enthusiastic about what's going on, but it's not a real company yet. It's just a collection of customers with a very exciting product that probably isn't quite finished yet. And there's no ecosystem behind it. There's no big market capability behind it. And Crossing the Chasm is saying, in order to take the next step, you need to become a big fish in a small pond. But the pond has got to be a big enough for you to grow, probably yourself, maybe 5x. So, but if you're a $50 million company, that means the pond has to be maybe $300 million pond, $400 million pond. Well, most large corporations look at a $300 million market as, frankly, a little bit subscale. So the good news is those ponds are looking for someone who would be their leader and would really champion their specific pond-specific cause. And Crossing the Chasm is all about converting your company to becoming that leader. What does that take? And it turns out that venture-backed companies are very well suited to taking on that challenge, whereas their larger competitors often are at the margin, are more willing to neglect it.
We've got a number of listeners who have recent startups, Jeff. I mean, my business, Far North's just over a year old. And I've noticed businesses really running lean and bootstrapping. And we all know the stats on startups. So in your experience, what have you noticed in business, the difference in bringing investors in as opposed to running a lean ship?
Well, I think I'm a big fan of running a lean ship wherever you can. The only time when you cannot run a lean ship is if the category is moving faster than your organic growth could keep up with. So if as long as you can run a lean ship, and I would say if you're trying to build a business of from $1 to $10 million a year, there's no reason ever to take an investor, except maybe some help from family and friends or an angel who have to take a personal interest in either you or your technology. But you don't need venture investment for that. But if you're trying to build a business that's going to go to 100 million and maybe eventually even conceivably $1 billion business, and you're going to do that within a decade, that takes you have to put on the gas at some point. Then the question is, yes, but what year? What we see, the big failure mode we see in venture capital is going big too early. And again, Crossing the Chasm is a cautionary tale there. It says, don't go big until after you've crossed the chasm. Save your money in advance. It's not expensive to cross the chasm. It's expensive to be what we call inside the tornado, which is when the category really does take off, and you need to spend very, very aggressively in order to capture market share in a market that's taking off. So those are some of the strategies.
So in those 1 to 10 million companies, I know you're a fan, and you mentioned in your books of I was going to say niches, but you would say niches, yeah.
Well,
So
it depends. It depends on which side of the pond I'm on, whether I say niche or niche.
okay, but in terms of niching down, I mean, you're an advocate for that, yeah?
Yeah, oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the key idea in any business, even if you're literally a dog walking business in your own neighborhood, you want to be the leader in your market. So we call it fish to pond ratio. So you have to figure out how big is my fish and how big can I make my fish in the next year, and then you want to spend most of your time in a marketplace where at your size or at the size you aspire to grow to in the next 1 to 2 years, you could be 30 to 35 to even 50% of the market of that market. And because that causes the reason why is because everybody's business needs to have an ecosystem of support. Maybe it's just some extra services, maybe it's referrals, maybe somebody provides a product that fits with your service or a service that fits with your product. But in order for anybody to become part of an ecosystem and pay any attention to it and give it real energy, they have to do it around the leader. They don't want to do it around somebody who's third or fourth or fifth in the market. So that's why it's incredibly important that you create a leadership position for yourself, not just in your own mind, but in the mind of your customers and partners.
Is that through marketing, Jeff?
Yeah. The key idea, the first idea about marketing then is target market. So I think, it is challenging when you're first starting a business. Look, lots of sales is not what you have. So the idea of turning down a sale or moving away from a sale is just like, why would I ever do that? But what you really are looking to do is to get sale after sale after sale into the same community. Because when after a while that community starts hearing about you and they start telling their friends about you, and you start getting sales that you didn't even ask for. You start getting referrals and people calling you instead of you always having to call them. But that only happens once word of mouth has gotten to a certain level of concentration. And if you keep selling in different communities, you never get the concentration of word of mouth, and it just never happens.
There's riches in niches, eh?
Yeah, exactly. It really, and it's what's fun about it is individual small companies are so good at serving niches because just you want to make sure you kind of align it with your personal heart, so that like for
Sure.
example in my case, I fell in love with certain this B2B tech thing, and my heart was in it, and so I'm not a technical person, but my heart was in the challenge, and so it was easy for me to just spend a lot of time there when other people might say, well, it's time to move on. And that's what I think, where I think the small companies have a huge advantage over the large companies.
It's funny you say you're not a tech person there, Jeff, and I think a lot of our clients aren't tech, and I think now you have to have the ability to be quite tech and quite digital. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think, see, when I basically for the life of my career, it was always a person to person world. I mean, and digital was always kind of ancillary. And I think what we're seeing now is that, particularly in B2C, digital has become the fabric of business. So that now it isn't like you automate your business. Your business is digital. It begins digitally. It's conducted digitally. You connect with your customer digitally. If you may even deliver your service digitally, but you certainly do an enormous amount of your work, and connecting with partners and connecting with suppliers and customers and everything. So yeah, for somebody to say I can't, like in my case, although I've written a couple of programs in my life, I couldn't code for the life of me. So as a result, that makes it very, very difficult, I think, to take advantage of all the resources that are available to young entrepreneurs today. You just really you don't have to have everybody on the team be a strong coder and strong developer, but you got to build around those folks. That is the core talent.
My mum was just thinking there earlier on, we mentioned about entrepreneurship, and I was just thinking about Dragon's Den and Shark Tank over your side of the water and how popular it is now to be an entrepreneur. But there's a lot of entrepreneurs now who are looking for sort of passive income. And a lot of people think you could just create a site and run up an email list and it would just work for you. Do you ever come across that? People
Yeah,
trying
for
to ask
sure.
you hard
It
advice.
reminds me. So when I was growing up, people wanted to be rock stars, and they wanted to be artists, but they didn't actually want to create art. They just wanted to be artists, right? Because if you were
Sure.
artists, you're kind of cool, and maybe you could, hang out with cool chicks, and it'd be great. That's kind of how it is with this faux entrepreneur. They want to be an entrepreneur because it's cool to be an entrepreneur, but they don't actually want to work. They don't actually want to actually take personal risk. They just want to
Yes.
kind of, coast. And entrepreneurship is just brutal on people like this because you just end up being unemployed and then if you stay unemployed long enough, you'll lose the courage to get employed. So it's actually a very dangerous trap. And I think I'm very skeptical of somebody who wants to be an entrepreneur right out of college. It's like, okay, but it might not be bad for you to have one or two experiences in a work environment, even just to confirm that you don't want to do this. But at least you to make sure you know the disciplines, the core disciplines of work that have been handed down from the past generation, even if though your intention is to work in a very different mode.
Totally agree. Totally agree. So, how would you suggest to somebody who wanted to start, who were in an organization now and they had an idea or they had a vision, how could they start off? What would you suggest?
Well, so I think it's different with different companies, but my personal experience was I try to staple myself to a problem first of all, I try to find customers that I would care about who have problems that I'm interested in that they are struggling to get solved. And that can be anything, right? If people you care about, a challenge that they're struggling to meet, either because they don't have time to meet it or they don't have the skills to meet it, and that nobody has found a really great answer to, so that your creativity could actually move the needle in that market. And then I think you just go get a customer. And I mean, for me, the best kinds of businesses are the ones where you say, well, I'll just throw my personal energy into the void, and I will fill the solution space with my personal energy, and I'll solve it for one person. No matter, come hell or high water, we'll figure out something that works. And then you come away from that experience saying, well, is there anything that I've learned or created during that experience that I can use with the next customer? And then the next customer. And eventually, over time, what happens is you realize that there is a core of capability, whether it goes into a product or into an online service or into a face-to-face service, that is repeatable. And then you start creating a playbook. We call that transition going from projects to playbooks. And you can build a $1 to $10 million business around playbooks. In fact, just one or two playbooks. And eventually you hire people to help you with those playbooks, but the playbook is what holds the business together. To get much larger than that, you probably have to go into some sort of product or system model, which scales more than just your payroll, and that's another challenge. But for most of us who are, if you could be happy with $10 million a year in a private business, and having a very good quality of life, we sometimes call those lifestyle businesses. I mean, that to me is victory.
So you mentioned there about hella high water and putting, keep at it until it works. Are we not talking about making money there? Are we talking about putting a lot of time in and not worrying about how much money you make out of it, just to get that project and to get that client portfolio under your belt to help you move on?
I think you have to get paid. I think you need to get paid something because first of all, you want to make sure that you're doing something that the customer really values, and so getting paid is a way of verifying that the customer values it. It also incents the customer to hold you accountable, which is actually very good for you as well. So I would say you're probably not going to be profitable because you're going to put in a lot more than you're going to get out in those first couple of projects, but I wouldn't do it for free. And I would basically want to be able to support myself as an individual, maybe on a lean budget, but I want to support myself by whatever I got paid for it. And part of that also teaches you, can you sell? It turns out that many more people are good at delivering a service than are good at selling a service. And so if you're going to be entrepreneurial, you really do have to be able to sell. And so that this will teach you. And if it turns out you can't, then you need to join an organization that sells for you. And you can still deliver the service you want to deliver, but it would be after somebody sold it for you. And therefore, you don't get the anything like the economic rewards. The person who can sell it and do it both is the person who can capitalize so much right now on the digital infrastructure that makes makes even a very small company look like a big company, because you have so much that you can do online, even as a company of one.
Jeff, I could listen to you all day. I'm looking at there. We've done about half an hour.
Well, I'm glad. That's good to hear. Any last issues, or should we just sign off?
Hey, we've only touched upon certain things, and I know there's lots of things on YouTube for our listeners all they've got to do is search for you, and there's a whole host of stuff on there. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, the site, I think the site is geoffreyamoore.com, and I do spell it like the Geoffrey Chaucer. But if you look there, there's a bunch of videos and whatnot that might be helpful.
Brilliant. And where could we start with your books, Jeff?
Well, I think if you're a small company, if you're a startup or a small company, I do think Crossing the Chasm is the book to read. And if you're somebody who's in a larger company and they're struggling with innovation, then I think the book to read is Zone to Win.
Is which one? Sorry, the Zone to Win.
Zone to Win, yeah. And both are available on Amazon. They're readily available on Amazon.
Brilliant stuff. Well, Jeff, thanks so much for your time. And I know it's early morning for you over in California there.
Well, good to talk with you, Ian, and I hope your listeners enjoyed it.
Thank you to Geoffrey Moore there. If you're like me and you've got an interest in business and marketing, well, of course you have, because you listen to the show. You'll know all about Jeff. You'll know all about how respected he is and the work he's done. Just check him out on Google and Geoffrey A. Moore. You'll find him, done some great work. And I've had this episode lined up for quite some time now, so I'm stoked to get it out here. I wish I could let you know who else is in the diary, actually, so I'm keeping my powder dry. I'm not telling you. But just remember to keep in touch. All the links are on industryangel.com. So I'm Ian Farrer. This is the Industry Angel. And again, thanks for listening.